I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone for tuning into the History of Cyprus podcast, and to those of you who have now supported the podcast on Patreon. Thank you so much. Again, this podcast is not monetized, so your financial support helps offset the costs of producing the show, the primary sources, and of course, it keeps it ad free. Please check out the History of Cyprus podcast on Patreon, where your support can get you early access to upcoming episodes and help keep this project going. Remember, I can also be found on Instagram, and you can always reach me at cyprusthepodcast@gmail.com. Dr. Angel Nicolaou-Konnari is an associate professor in medieval history at the University of Cyprus, specializing in the field of Hellenism under Latin rule. Her research interests include various aspects of Cypriot society during the Lusinian and Venetian periods, as well as medieval Greek and Latin prejudices and ethnicities. Additionally, she is the principal investigator of the research program Recapturing, Documenting, Digitizing, and Promoting the Mill Heritage of Cyprus, and one of the coordinators of the joint research program Digitizing Medieval Cyprus between the University of Cyprus and King's College London. Dr. Nicolaou-Konnari was also an expert advisor to the Cyprus UNESCO Committee from 2010 to 2021 on safeguarding intangible cultural heritage, and she is currently completing a book on the lives of two Cypriots during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Pietro and Giorgio de Noris. Except for today, she is here with us so kindly to speak about a very well-known and popular character in medieval history, and that is Richard the Lionheart and Richard the Lionheart's conquest of Cyprus in 1191. Angel, thank you for accepting my invitation, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Andreas.
So, first off, I always like talking about sources when exploring the historical era. So, what can you tell us about the historical sources for Richard the Lionheart's conquest? How do historians sift the facts from the legends? How do we make sure that we're getting the full picture?
Well, we're very lucky, actually, because we've got a very large amount of written sources for the Third Crusade and for this Cyprus events. We've got Byzantine sources, including native Cypriot ones. We've got Latin Eastern sources, testimonies from the Crusader states in Syria and Palestine, English sources, of course, either from England or from Richard's continental lands, written in French. And then we've got French sources, German sources, Arabic, Syriac, Armenian, Flemish, and Italian. Some of these sources they just mention briefly the events. Others, they give long, detailed narratives. Most of the sources are contemporary to the events they describe, while some of them, the most precious ones, are those which represent first-hand testimony of eyewitnesses, people who either accompanied Richard on his expedition, or people who were Cypriots and they lived through the events. We are lucky to also have two documents which emanate from Richard himself. His dispatch to his justiciar, dated 6th of August 1191, in which dispatch he mentions the conquest of Cyprus, and of course the settlement of dower upon Berengaria of Navarra, signed in Limassol on the wedding day on the 12th of May 1191. So we've got really two documents emanating from Richard, precious testimony. And we also have a letter written by a very well-known Cypriot saint, Saint Neophytos the Recluse. Neophytos is an eyewitness. He lived in Cyprus at the moment of the conquest. So he knew He had a first-hand knowledge of the events, and in this letter, he describes the conquest from the point of view of a native Cypriot. Obviously, all these sources relate the events from a specific ideological standpoint, whether this is an English standpoint or a Byzantine or a Cypriot or whatever. So a historian has to be very careful and in order to discern the real events behind accusations, exaggerations. But of course, this is not something unique for the Third Crusade. This is something a historian always does. Similarly, stories which may have been interpolated later or stories which represent popular myths, a historian is always careful with them. Such a story is the one about Isaac demanding silver chains instead of iron chains. Many chronicles repeat this story, but of course we cannot be sure whether this is true or not. It certainly reflects the negative portrait most of the Western and Byzantine sources draw of Isaac.
Just to contextualize Cyprus in this period, did it oscillate from one of importance to one of inconsequence? Like, how did Cyprus fit in the Eastern Roman Empire at the time?
Well, this is what we call the second Byzantine period of the history of Cyprus. Second, after the what we call Arab Byzantine condominium on the island, which ended 965 in the middle of the 10th century. So this is the second Byzantine period. We are at the end of the 12th century. Since the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire goes through territorial losses suffered because of the advances of the Muslims, Arabs, and Turks, advances of the Armenians, and of course, advances of the Western Europeans within the Crusades. So, because of the loss of territory suffered by the empire, Cyprus, at the end of the 11th century and throughout the 12th century, reemerges as an important naval base for the empire. It's the easternmost frontier of the empire. Now, the empire is more or less limited in its Greek speaking lands. So, Cyprus represents the easternmost frontier of the empire, and obviously a very, very important naval base. Cyprus is also at the time within the framework of the Crusades and the Crusader states founded in Syria and Palestine at the end of the 11th century. Cyprus now has a very important role as a source of supplies for these Crusader states, and also as a possible refuge for the Christians in Syria and Palestine in case of Muslim advances.
Okay, so let's talk about Isaac Komnenos,
Yes.
which he is a very important character in this period and to Richard the Lionheart's conquest. So I want to know basically how would we characterize him? Is he a usurper? Can you tell us basically who is this guy? How does he seize control? And what were his motivations in capturing Cyprus first before Richard the Lionheart?
Historically and politically, Isaac Doukas Komnenos gave the final stroke to the already fragile political frontier of the empire in terms of Eastern Mediterranean. He was a member of the royal family. He was a great nephew of the Emperor Manuel I Komnenos. His great uncle appointed him governor of Cilicia, um, uh, that is Lesser Armenia, sometime in the 1170s. He didn't get on well with the Armenians. He was captured by them. He was sold to the Templars. He was imprisoned by the Templars. And at some time, another Byzantine emperor, Andronikos I Komnenos, paid the ransom for Isaac to be liberated. Isaac then raised a force of mercenaries, of opportunists, and came to Cyprus. In Cyprus, it is not clear whether he seized control of the island by presenting to the authorities forged letters of appointment, or whether he was legitimately appointed to the office of the governor. At any rate, he became governor of the island, and at some point in 1184, he claimed himself emperor of the island. And Neophytos the Recluse gives us the details and allows us to give, a specific date to this event. 1184, he proclaims himself emperor of Cyprus, and actually we have coins survive from his governorship and from his time of being the emperor of Cyprus. And on the coins we have the title Isakios Despotis, a title reserved for the emperors. So he was a very, very ambitious person, a very clever person, apparently, a very able person who used his abilities to become the ruler of Cyprus.
Did Emperor Manuel I, did he try recovering Cyprus from his nephew? I recall that supposedly a naval force was dispatched in 1186, but they were defeated. So did the Byzantines try to recover it? And if not, or if they weren't unsuccessful, why did they stop?
Well, the emperor at the time was Isaac II Angelos. So we have a new dynasty. It's not the Komneni anymore, it's the Angeli. And this is indicative. This tells us why Constantinople couldn't recover Cyprus. There were dynastic rivalries, there were coups, emperors coming and going, killing each other. So, yes, when Isaac II Angelos, after his access to the throne in 1185, he put together a fleet and sent it to Cyprus to recover the island. That was the only military attempt made by Constantinople. It was a humiliating defeat for Constantinople. Isaac was had the assistance of the Sicilian Admiral Margaritone. In Sicily at the time, the Normans were the rulers. So Isaac's second wife was related to the royal family of Sicily, and this is we suppose that this is how the alliance took place. So the Sicilians, the Normans of Sicily, helped Isaac. He defeated the imperial army, and Constantinople didn't try again to recover Cyprus. We are in 1186, as you said. We must remember that only in a few years' time, it's the Fourth Crusade in 1204. So Constantinople will not be able to recover Cyprus. Constantinople will be lost to the Crusaders. So, and even when the Byzantines recover Constantinople in 1261, they will have other more urgent problems than Cyprus. So, indeed, we can say that Isaac's actions led or prepared the way for the conquest of Cyprus by Richard the Lionheart, and then the sale of the island to the Lusinians. Cyprus will never be part of any Greek state again.
And before the Fourth Crusade, we have the Third Crusade. And it's a
Exactly.
very famous story. I think many listeners will know that King Richard the Lionheart, the Coeur de Lion of, of England, who ironically, although he's the King of England, would have spoken French, he's on his way to reclaim Jerusalem for the Christian West. And as many listeners know the story, or part of his fleet flounders off the coast of Cyprus and they're captured. Now, I was hoping you could tell us basically what series of events unfold in this period, because you will certainly do a better job than I. But I'm also really curious about Richard's motivations, because in the sources, it's this incidental event. It's portrayed as I wasn't planning on taking Cyprus, but Isaac Komnenos, he's this terrible person and he insulted my honor and he insulted my future queen. And I needed to, by God, have justice. So I came across in one of your articles that there is a historical source that mentions that Richard had an enterprise in mind to make him go to the port of Limassol. And even Arab sources claim that it was Richard's intentions to actually capture Cyprus. What's your take? What exactly unfolds in this period?
We don't really know whether the invasion of Cyprus was by Richard was intentional, planned, or an accident of history. Definitely, the English sources, and when I say English, I mean sources that emanate from Richard's citizens, subjects, not written in English. Okay, so the English sources are very, very, very careful, to show that yes, it was an accident brought upon Isaac and upon the island because of Isaac's actions. Now, on the other hand, if one reads all the sources very carefully, there are there is some evidence, there are suggestions that obviously Richard must have known of the geostrategical importance of Cyprus for the cause of the Crusades, of the crusading movement. And one English source says, it's Ambroise, he's a chronicle, he's very explicit when he says that Richard, when he arrived in Rhodes, he made inquiries about Cyprus and had this thought in his mind. Other sources, for example, say that when the King of France asked Richard, why did you delay your arrival to Palestine, with this business in Cyprus? Richard answers that I did it because Cyprus is very important for our cause. So there are some pieces of evidence that indicate that, of course, Richard could appreciate the political and geostrategical importance of Cyprus for the cause of the Crusades. On the other hand, it seems that Isaac also was afraid of a possible invasion by the Crusaders. He was prepared for such an invasion. And actually, English sources again claim that he had an alliance with Saladin, the Muslim leader. We cannot tell if this is true, but it's possible. He was definitely aware, he was afraid that the Crusaders might attack his island. Of course, on the other hand, we cannot deny the fact that Isaac behaved badly to Richard's fiancée and sister, and also to other English ships, which were wrecked on the shores of Cyprus. That was the perfect excuse for Richard. The fact that Isaac behaved badly to the two ladies and to other crusaders, and also the fact that Isaac was a usurper gave Richard the perfect justification. He wasn't attacking Byzantine land, but he was attacking someone who had stolen land from Byzantium. So legally, he was more or less legitimated. And these justifications are always present. We can see them in English sources.
Since Isaac was a usurper and he essentially is dethroned by Richard, did the Byzantines at any point say, okay, he was illegitimate, can we have Cyprus back? Did that happen at all?
Yes, yes, they did claim it. They did make claims to the Pope also. But again, we are in 1191. There is a dynastic crisis again in Byzantium. Within the Angeli dynasty, the brother dethrones his brother, blinds him and dethrones him. And this crisis will lead to the events of the Fourth Crusade, the capture of Constantinople by the Venetians and the Crusaders. So by the time the empire could get organized and claim Cyprus, the Fourth Crusade took place. So after that, the empire could do nothing really.
You mentioned some of the dignitaries accompanying Richard to the Holy Land. King Richard's mother, is that possible? Was she along
No,
with
no, no,
him?
no, she wasn't. No,
Okay.
Eleanor of Aquitaine, or Aquitaine rather. I always tend to pronounce the French names the French way. Well, Eleanor was a very, very energetic woman, as you may know, and she was really worried that Richard was still single. He didn't have an heir to the throne. So he took his bride, Berengaria of Navarra, to Sicily, where Richard had made a stop in order to see through the problems his sister was facing. His sister was the widow of the king of Sicily, so Richard wanted to recover her dowry and take her with him. So Eleanor arrives in Sicily with the bride to be, Berengaria. Probably this is why we have so many prelates, important prelates accompanying Richard. The performance of the wedding, the celebration of the wedding, was planned to take place in Sicily. The problem is that by the time Eleanor arrived, it was Lent, and no wedding could take place during Lent, as you know. So, what was plan B? Joan of Sicily, Richard's sister, would escort Berengaria, and Berengaria and Joan would follow Richard on his expedition, and the wedding would take place in Syria or Palestine, in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But of course, the events took a different direction. The episode in Cyprus took place, and the wedding finally took place in Cyprus because Lent was over. So we assume that the fact that Richard was accompanied by prelates was a premeditated action. Yes, he wanted to be married to Berengaria on his expedition.
How did the residents of Cyprus fare during Richard's expedition? For example, in one of the sources, I don't recall exactly which one, it could have been Benedict of Peterborough, mentions that Limassol was deserted. But at the same time, other sources, and maybe even the same one, mentions that Richard, and I quote, tried to protect the local population, end quote. So were they merely passive observers? Were they happy to see him? Were they disappointed to see him? How did they react to his presence on the island?
The expedition took exactly 1 month. Richard probably arrived on the island on the fifth or 6th of May, and he leaves on the 5th of June. In 1 month, Richard took the entire island, and depending on the sources, we have different itineraries about his expedition on the island. But if we combine all the sources, we see that he actually went. Richard or his army, I mean, they went everywhere on the island, from Paphos to Apostolos Andreas, Cape Andreas. So, and from Kyrenia to Amochostos, and from Limassol to Nicosia. So they went everywhere. So obviously, the island must have been, and the inhabitants must have been affected, given the extent and the military nature of the expedition. I always like to compare Richard's invasion of Cyprus. With modern terms, with let's say the Americans invading Cyprus today. The size and the of his army, and the weapons and the horses and all the ammunition and everything was really we can compare it to an American force invading Cyprus today. Isaac tried to resist, he couldn't. It must have been a negative experience for the native population. But as you said, English sources are particularly careful to reassure us that Richard gave specific instructions to his soldiers not to harm the population. On the other hand, Neophytos the Recluse is very, very, very verbally violent against Richard, but he does it in a very vague way. He does say that Richard robbed the island, but he doesn't really say that he killed people. So we also have other sources, English, including Neophytos himself, which say that the local population were so disappointed with Isaac's rule that they actually welcomed Richard, especially the rich, the old elite of Cyprus. They have probably lost their property because of Isaac's confiscations and Isaac's, heavy taxation. So now they welcomed Richard. We have evidence in the sources about the population of Limassol and the population of Nicosia. And as I said, Neophytos the Recluse, a Cypriot himself, he says that everybody went to Richard and abandoned Isaac, which shows that they were so fed up with Isaac that they believed that perhaps Richard would have been a better ruler. And one of the sources claims that they gave Richard, the ruling class of Nicosia, gave Richard half of their possessions in return of the laws they had under Manuel Komnenos, the Byzantine emperor, which shows that Isaac was a dictator who didn't respect any of the Byzantine laws.
Can you share this interesting, albeit it is somewhat dubious, story of Statinos Nazares? I don't know if I said that right. I think his name is Tatikios, who I believe may have been a general or a high-ranking officer for Isaac, and who is captured by Richard. I don't know the story. I just remember coming across it and thinking, "Wow, this is very fascinating." Can you share that story with the
Of
listeners?
course, this is an incident told by three late 13th, early 14th century chronicles. So it's not a story we find in contemporary sources written by eyewitnesses. So it's a story we find in later chronicles, and it might be a later interpolation of a character we find during the First Crusade, a Byzantine general, Tatikios. The story goes like that. Statinus, who was one of Isaac's officials, advised Isaac to surrender to the English king because he knew that it was impossible to face Richard's forces. Isaac was very angry, and in one of his notorious fits of anger, he cut off a slice of Statinus's nose. So, ever since then, the Statinus was called Statin le Nazé in French, or Statinus Nasatus in Latin. In Greek, one would say kommomutinos. We have this verb in Greek texts because nose mutilation, rhinotomy, was a typical Byzantine punishment mentioned in several Byzantine legal codes. So Statinus Nasatus escaped to the English camp and offered Richard his services, delivering all the castles and cities of the island, as well as Isaac's daughter, to the English king. And of course, a great number, the story goes, a great number of Isaac's barons followed Statinus's example and did homage to Richard. And after Isaac's capture, Richard made Statinus the governor of Cyprus. So the story, it's probably, as I said, a later interpolation. It takes elements from stories of the First Crusade. It adapts it's adapted to the Third Crusade and to the Cypriot events. But although its authenticity is dubious, it does indicate once more that the native population of Cyprus were really very hostile towards Isaac, and some of them at least welcomed Richard.
So other sources say that many of the citizens actually even went to congratulate Richard after the conquest. They defected and shaved their beards. Why would they have shaved their beards as an act of contrition? What is that all about?
Well, the beards, well, let's say hair, it's it's a very, very important cultural difference between East and West in Middle Times, in the Middle Ages. In the West, men had long hair and shaven faces. That's the German tradition. Long hair and shaven faces. In the East, in Byzantium, men had short hair but bearded faces. This was, a huge cultural difference for the Byzantines. The Western fashion was very effeminate, whereas for the Westerners, Byzantine fashion was very barbaric. And this is why the Western sources say that as a token of submission, Cypriots shaved their faces.
What happened to Isaac after he's captured? What is his fate? And I mentioned at the start of this interview that he is eventually captured, asks not to be put in chains of iron, and Richard acquiesces and instead puts him in chains of silver, and I think some other sources suggest even gold. What is his fate?
Well, he Richard took him with him to Palestine, and he gave him to the master of the Hospitallers, in whose custody he was held in the castle of Markap near Tripoli in northern Syria. A castle, we're not sure it exists today because of the war, of the recent, war in Syria. He was imprisoned, so in that castle. It was a hospitaller castle. He stayed there for several years. Latin Eastern sources claim that he died in prison, but Byzantine sources claim that he was liberated at some stage, and again he started his conspiracies, his intrigues, inciting the Sultan against the Byzantine Empire. Supposedly, according to Byzantine sources, he died by poison at about 1195.
You mentioned Isaac as having a black legend, creating enemies both east and west. I mean, there was even one source that supposedly said that he had gold and silver statues of himself made and set up in churches. You know, on Good Friday, he was even worshipped, offered sacrifices, terrorized people, and even purportedly killed his own son. How authentic are these accusations? Have the sources really been unfair to Isaac?
Well, what we can say is that Isaac was demonized by all sources. Whether they are Western, Byzantine, Cypriot, Latin Eastern. So, all writers, for all writers, Isaac represents, the stereotypical image of the other, of a person, of a negative person, for different reasons. For the English, it's obvious why. He was the usurper. He was someone who was unfaithful to his lord, the emperor, who didn't behave honorably to women or to the crusaders. So this way they justified Richard's behavior. For the Latin Eastern sources, the same. For the Byzantines, obviously, he was also the prototype, the archetype of the enemy, because he defied the emperor several times, several occasions. He took Cyprus. For Neophytos the Recluse, he was to blame for all the ills that befell upon Cyprus, after his taking over the rule of the island. Because of him, Richard came, and because of him, the Lusignans came afterwards, and Cyprus was never to be part of the Byzantine Empire again. So he was demonized by all sources, but for separate reasons. For Neophytos, I repeat, it was because he separated Cyprus from the Byzantine ecumeny. Now, obviously, we cannot be sure about, the extent of the accusations. Of course, his assumption of an imperial lifestyle is described with hubristic extremes by these writers, especially the Westerners. Some historians claim that perhaps what they say about silver statues and set up in churches, perhaps they say that these chronicles misunderstood the imperial ritual. We have a cultural misunderstanding of the Byzantine imperial etiquette, because this is what Isaac tried to do. Proclaiming himself an emperor, obviously he followed the imperial rituals, and these were misunderstood by the Westerners. We cannot tell. Definitely, he was a very, very ambitious and a very, very ruthless person. But obviously, there is exaggeration in the descriptions of the time.
Now back to Richard.
Yes.
He successfully conquers the island, and shortly after the conquest, he makes a decision to sell Cyprus to the Knights Templar. Why did he sell Cyprus, and why did the Knights Templar purchase it from Richard?
Well, it's obvious from the sources again that Richard never intended to keep the island. When he leaves the island and goes to Palestine, he does leave a small garrison on the island with two governors, but only a small garrison because obviously he wants to take the his all his forces to Palestine to fight against the Muslims. He There is also evidence that okay, he took lots of money and supplies from the island, but it seems that he didn't want to keep the island for himself, and we may see these in the settlement of Dower upon Berengaria, which was signed in Limassol on the wedding day on 12th of May 1191. No title concerning Cyprus or rights to Cyprus are assigned to Berengaria on this settlement of Dower. The small contingent which was left on the small English contingent left in Cyprus after Richard's departure seems to have faced very, very quickly a sort of insurrection. We Only the English sources talk about this insurrection. Neophytos the Recluse doesn't speak about it. Neither do the Latin Eastern sources. And this shows that perhaps this kind of insurrection was insignificant. It seems that some of Isaac's men tried to proclaim another emperor and revolt against Isaac's men. The rebels were easily crushed, and their leader was hanged. This must have happened probably about a month after Richard's departure. But when Richard was informed, he didn't want to keep the island, he didn't want the trouble. So he decided to sell the island, and the Templars were willing to buy it for 100,000 bezants. That was the dollars of the time. It was a small amount. If we compare it with, for example, the taxation of the island or the sale of other territories. It was a small amount, which shows that Richard was really eager to get rid of the island. The Templars bought it because for them it was the perfect place to use it as their headquarters. Very near Syria and Palestine, an island with a natural frontier, a rich island, a fertile island. So for the Templars, a military or religious order, it was the perfect place. They paid Richard in advance 40,000 bezants, and the remainder was to be paid out of the island's revenues. So, sometime in the summer of 1191, the Templars arrived on the island.
And when they do, it almost seems, at least in the historical sources, it almost seems that immediately Cypriots revolted again.
They do
And
revolt again.
yeah, so
Yes,
why so? What happened in such a short period of time that they're revolting against the
a
Templars?
revolt again. Well, it seems the Templars sent only a small force on the island, and apparently they wanted to exploit the island's resources to the most. So They imposed very, very heavy taxation on the islanders. And the revolt this time seems to have been the result of oppressive administration. We don't have, Isaac's supporters. It wasn't political this time. It has a definite popular character. It happened in early April 1192. It was Easter time. Lots of Cypriots gathered in the capital, in Nicosia. It was the Saturday of the Holy Week, 4th of July 1192, on the occasion of a market day. Lots of people gather in Nicosia, and the sources this time are only the sources from the Latin East. So apparently, writers who knew about the events, and they tell us that the Cypriots realized that the number of the Templar Knights wasn't that high, wasn't that big, and they thought that they could face them and kill them and throw them out of Cyprus. They decided to attack on Easter Sunday, but they didn't really take into consideration the expertise of the Templars in the matters of the war. The sources say that although indeed the Templars were very, very few, they managed to slaughter the Greeks. The Templars were really professional warriors. They slaughtered the Greeks indiscriminately, like sheep. And but again, the fact that Neophytos the Recluse doesn't speak about this revolt again suggests that it wasn't that extended. It wasn't that significant. It was of limited, let's say, importance.
In the sources, listeners might be surprised to hear that often they don't refer to the people of Cyprus as Greeks, but they call them Griffins.
Yeah.
And actually, you mentioned that Cypriots are attributed all the stereotypes associated with the
Yes.
Greeks. What are those stereotypes, and where does this term Griffin originate? Because it is pejorative.
The Crusades created the conditions for the West and the East to come together, but they also intensified prejudices on both sides. For the Westerners, the Greeks were, the Byzantines that is, were coward, effeminate, avaricious, cruel, heretics who hated the Latins, treacherous, arrogant, whereas the Westerners, they were the good warriors, excellent knights. The Greeks, they preferred to compromise. And the name Griffon apparently arose out of a phonetic confusion between griffin in English. In Greek, the word is grips, which is a legendary animal, head and wings of an eagle and body of a lion. So it's a monster. It's a legendary animal, but it's a negative animal, let's say. So the name Griffon probably arose out of a phonetic confusion between Griffon and the old French word for the Greeks, which is the ethnic name Grieux, Grec. Griffon, Grieux. So by the end of the 12th century, we find in French, especially French, but also Latin texts, the ethnic name Griffon, which designates the Greeks, the Byzantines. And it has negative connotations related with this legendary animal. The name disappears in the second half of the 14th century. And the Greeks of Cyprus are also called Griffon in many sources.
And finally, we come to the end of our story where where the Templars presumably, I mean, you'll have to elaborate a little bit here, maybe because of the rebellion, maybe because of the hassle of keeping Cyprus. For some reason, within a year, they sold it to Guy de Lusignan, who purchased Cyprus. So, who were they? Who were the Lusignans? Was it sold? Was it given? And
Well,
how did their governance differ from that of the Templars?
the Lusignans were a family of the lower nobility in the county of Poitou. Even today, there is a place called Lusignan in Poitou in western France. But at the time, the area was a fief belonged to the King of England, the Plantagenets. Okay, so the Lusignans were feudatories of Richard the Lionheart. The members of the family had come to the to the east before the Third Crusade. Guy of Lusignan, according to the sources, was quite a handsome guy. So the Queen of Jerusalem fell in love with him, and she married him, and this is how he became King of Jerusalem. But apparently, he wasn't a very, very successful general because he lost battles to the Muslims, and he lost the city of Jerusalem because of his bad decisions. So when his wife died, he no longer was king of Jerusalem. He derived the title from his marriage. Okay, his wife was the heir to the throne, not himself. So when his wife died, he was no longer king of Jerusalem, and because he wasn't really very popular amongst the nobility of Jerusalem, and because he was Richard's vassal, Richard asked him whether he wanted to buy Cyprus after the Templars returned it to him. Guy thought it's the perfect solution for me to have a kingdom. So he bought it. Some sources claim that it was given to him for free. We don't believe that. These sources are really unreliable. Apparently, Richard transferred to Guy the agreement he had with the Templars. So Guy paid. Actually, he had a loan from the Genoese and paid the Templars the 40,000 advance they had given to Richard, and he owed Richard the rest of the money, the 60,000, which he never paid. So the British, the English, they could have claimed Cyprus. He never paid the entire sum, Guy or his successors. But Richard wasn't really interested. And when Guy died in 1194, Richard and then his heirs failed to claim Cyprus. So the sovereignty of the Lusignan dynasty was affirmed, and nobody disputed it. Their rule was very wise. This is the word I want to use. Wise in the sense that they already had the experience of living in an eastern country with a native population that wasn't Latin. And I'm talking about, the Kingdom of Jerusalem in Syria and Palestine. So they knew that they had to compromise a lot. They knew that they shouldn't oppress the local population, and they also knew that they had to respect a number of the older institutions. And this is what they did. So the 3th century rule of the Lusignans didn't witness any insurrections on the part of the Greeks. There were civil wars, there were invasions, but not on the part of the Greeks.
I have one final question
Yes,
for
please.
this period, and it is about the survival of these events in oral tradition. For example, there's a story I think a lot of people know about the local variety of grapes in Cyprus called Verico. And one of the stories is that Richard arrives and mentions that these grapes are great. They're very good, and that's one of the ways the word Verico comes into play, which is simply untrue. What sort of other impact do we have in today's oral tradition on the land, on the landscape, on the people of Cyprus from this period?
Well, not much survives in modern oral tradition. There are some popular stories about the location of Richard's landing. It was in Amathus, and this is why Amathus, the ancient town of Amathus, that the ancient town of Amathus was destroyed by Richard, which is not true, again, because we know by excavations that Amathus was abandoned a lot earlier, and Limassol existed at the time. Also, that the site of his camp in the area of Limassol, it was probably in Polemidia village near Limassol, and this is why the village is named Polemidia. We cannot tell. Also, that in Nicosia, his army camped where the presidential palace now stands. This is apparently a myth created when the British came to Cyprus for a second time at the end of the 19th century. And of course, the most popular legend is the one you mentioned about the Verico. It's a Cypriot variety of grapes, and people make the connection, the similarity between very good and Verico. So they think that the name Verico, as you said, derives from Richard showing his appreciation when he tasted this variety on the island. This is, of course, unfounded. As you said at the beginning of this conversation, Richard spoke French, so he would have said très bien. And on the other hand, he was in Cyprus in May, which is very early in the season for grapes in Cyprus. Let me finish by saying that what is true is that, if I may use, colloquial language, Richard did all the dirty work for the Lusignans. When the Lusignans came to the island, Richard, his invasion was so terrifying that there was no wish on the part of the Cypriots to resist or fight again. So he really did the dirty work for the Lusignans.
Wow, Angel, that was fantastic. You really did King Richard the Lionheart justice with this interview today, with this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.